Hello, everyone. Welcome. My name is Hannah Rushtuk, and I'm the postdoctoral research associate at the IHRR. And I'm welcoming you to our first of this academic year's the IHRR seminar series. So we've had these seminars for at least 6 or 7 years, and we invite a range of speakers from within the university and also from outside the university to speak on a range of topics related to risk, resilience, hazards. And today, with great pleasure, I'm going to introduce Maureen Fordham, who will be our first speaker. And she's going to speak about gender disasters and flood hazards. And Maureen is a professor of gender and disaster resilience. She's affiliated with Durham University and works with Alex Densmore, Katie Oven, and Dave Millage on a project related to earthquakes in China. And she's also working with UCL and Northumbria University. Maureen's been researching disasters since 1988, and she's a particular interest in marginalized and so-called vulnerable groups in disasters, with a major focus on women and children. And she's a founding member of the Gender and Disaster Network in 1998. And she's a coordinator of its website at the moment. And she's been frequently invited to participate as a gender and disaster policy expert for international level meetings, including within the UN system. And she's edited and is currently on the editorial board for several disaster-related journals. Lastly, which is quite exciting, Maureen is going to be launching a Center for Gender and Disasters at UCL in March of next year. And this will be an interdisciplinary gender and disaster research evidence base to complement the advocacy and educational work of the Gender and Disaster Network. So Maureen will speak for about 45-50 minutes, and then we will open up the floor to questions from the audience, and we will finish by 2:30 at the latest, and then the Taught Risk Masters will stay and talk a bit longer with Andreas. Thank you.
Okay, can you hear me okay? Great. A presentation in 3 parts. That's because not very long ago, Louise sent me an email saying, can you talk about floods? So I've shoehorned in, I've added floods. Floods are always in there somewhere because I started working in this field on flood issues. So there's always something about floods. But I've made it a separate section. But 45 minutes isn't very long, so I'm skating over quite a few things. And please just ask me questions, make observations. You don't have to wait till I finish. You can ask to say something anytime you like. I'm quite happy about that.
I think you need to do it on the laptop.
Oh, on this one?
Yeah.
Oh, okay. Right. Let's see. Right. Good. So I just put this slide up first of all because next year is quite important. Not as important as 2028 will be, but quite important when we're thinking about gender. I don't know how many countries might be represented in this room, and I don't know when in your respective countries women and other groups got the vote along with the dominant social group, usually males with property and standing, who always had a vote of some kind. But in 1918, this was the time when women started to get the vote, but it was somewhat limited. They had to be over 30 because they were regarded as children really before that time. And there were a number of criteria that they had to meet. So it was 1928 before all women got the vote in the UK, which is incredibly late if you think about it. And it varies a huge amount around the world, and not just women, but other social groups as well. So worth having a look at that when we're thinking about, as we are in this session, thinking about marginalised groups, sometimes called minority groups, but often when we're talking gender and we're thinking about women, not only women, but women, it's very difficult to think of women as a minority group when they're usually at least, if not more than 50% of a population. Certainly more than 50% in the room today. So the change that happened to get to that point where women had the vote was not a smooth process, and it was not without struggle. And I think this is the story really of what we're talking about today. Whenever we're thinking about groups that have not had equal rights, whatever they might be, there's always a story of struggle behind it to get to the point where they've achieved it or they're still trying to achieve it. So we can see this in the way we think about disasters and the extent to which our ideas have changed over time. So I begin just talking about gender and the gender binary, so male, female, and thinking beyond that. And this idea about gender inequality in highly economically developed countries of the world, sometimes it gets quite dismissed as surely, you know, we don't have this problem. You know, we have gender equality. But look at the data and you'll see around the world it's still hugely problematic. And issues around equality and equity, which we'll talk about. So first of all, because I know you're here from a range of backgrounds, and some of you may be from a social science background, some not. So you may not necessarily have thought about this issue, so I thought I'd just put a slide up to begin this. The word gender gets mentioned, it's mentioned in so many policies, so many international frameworks. So the word may be there, maybe, not always, but it may be. But typically, when people say that, they're really meaning women, and just women. They're not thinking about gender in that in the broad way that I'm talking about it today. Sex or gender? Well, sex typically would be a biological, physiological determination, but gender is socially constructed. It's about how what we think is appropriate for males and females and other genders in any society, and that changes a lot. It changes over time, it changes in place, it changes in context. Increasingly now we're thinking beyond the binary. So increasingly we're thinking, and you may have seen even today, the news today, that the NHS, the National Health Service, GPs are now being told to ask people about their sexual orientation. And that's for very good reasons, because we just do not know, because we typically, if we look at gender at all, we're really typically looking at sex. We're only interested in, are you male, are you female? And so the data that we have, the evidence base that we have, is extremely limited. What happens if you don't identify with either of those categories, as many people don't? So the ideas are changing, and it's becoming a lot more fluid broadly in society. But there is still, there are lots of battles still to be won on this, and there's a battle about whether men should be included when we're talking about gender. And there are some groups that only work on women and disasters, and there's still a huge piece of work to be done on that. But as Hannah said, I coordinate a group which is the Gender and Disaster Network, which has a significant number of males and other social identity categories. So we've never excluded males from our consideration, because we're thinking about the relations, the social relations between men and women, and how that changes who gets what, who gets to do what, and how, and when, and where, in our context today in terms of disasters. Equality or equity. I don't know if you've ever thought about the difference between those two words. They are different, and they would have different implications and lead to different outcomes. Equality is the goal. We want people to be equal. What you have should equal what I have. I shouldn't have more than you shouldn't have more than me. But equity is the way to reach it. So the picture at the bottom sort of illustrates that. So if you have equality, you would say you give the same amount equally to the different groups that you're interested in. But if one group is down here and one group is up here, and you give the same amount, they all get more, but there's still this divergence. So at some point you need to give this group much more so that they get up to a level with the other group. Then you can go for equality and everyone rises together. But this is quite a political issue, as you can imagine. It's much easier to take if you say, we're going to give everyone the same. But if you pick out certain groups and say, you're going to give more to that group than another, then it becomes highly politicized. And so it's an open question about whether you're working with an equity or an equality model, and how you would go about projecting that. So gender inequality hasn't gone away. People can quite often dismiss it as a third world problem, but it isn't. So EU league table, gender inequality in the UK as bad as 10 years ago. If you look at the data, we still have a problem. If you look around this university and you look at the number of female professors, well, there's 2 at least in the room today, but there are far fewer females in the higher categories in the university, and in just about everything else outside the university, and that's just in this country. There are lots of indices. So if you're interested in this, and you might not be interested in all of these topics, the gender, the disasters, the floods, but if you want to get some basic data, and you have access to this PowerPoint, so you can get this information afterwards. But there is a lot of data out there collected by various people. They're all slightly different. Gender Inequality Index, the Global Gender Gap Report, Gender Related Development Index. There's a bunch of stuff out there, and so you can. Maybe you're doing a piece of work, a piece of research around one particular country or 2 countries, and you want to do a comparison, then it's worth looking at where they stand in, say, the Human Development Index globally, and then where they stand in terms of gender and gender equality. And you can do that for most of the countries where the data is collected. So the image in the middle here is for the UK, and it's showing doing okay around education, doing okay around health, not so good around economy, and pretty poor around politics. So that will be to do with people's representation in Parliament, etc. And you can look at that kind of diagram, spider diagram, around the world. Okay, so that's sort of a basic look at gender. So now if we bring in disaster, well, certainly gender inequality hasn't gone away in disasters, but our ideas have changed over time. And the images there actually show some of that, because the two, is that going to, yeah. These two would be typical kind of disaster management, emergency management imagery. If you put disaster management in Google Images, and see what images come up. It was very much it was very much a male-dominated field, and women's contributions were pretty invisible. Things are changing slowly. Anyway, we'll talk a bit more about that as we go. So, gender inclusion, it's part of us thinking about disasters in the context of development. It's a development issue. Once you've got a disaster, or you've potentially got a disaster, it's a failure of development in many ways. We know about the hazard, yes, and we have some control to a degree, depending on what the hazard is, where it is, when it is, etc. But the social consequences and the social context of any hazard event that suddenly erupts is another story. And you really need to understand the social dynamics to understand why you get the differences that you do get around the world for what is often pretty much similar or very similar hazard and hazard event, but has very different consequences depending on where you are. So back in 2005, it was realised more fully into the frameworks at the time, the Hyogo Framework for Action, that disaster is a development issue. And we need to look at root causes of disaster vulnerability. So a familiar framing of this would be the pressure and release model from at risk. So I don't know how many of you are in the hazards masters or work on this field, but how many of you, for example, have looked at or are aware of At Risk, the book At Risk? Right. So 1994 was the first edition, 2004 second edition, and speaking to the need to challenge the idea that disasters were natural, and that really the hazard is the trigger down here, but to get to this point where you've got a disaster, you need to look at all of this. So I'm hopeful that most of you will have explored this already, and so I'm not going to go into everything, but we're really trying to track back through the unsafe conditions, the dynamic pressures, and the root causes of vulnerability that create the disaster that we see on the ground. And if you really add in the gender, you can see, why don't we foreground some of this? Why don't we make it overt and think about it and do a gender analysis? Because a lot of the time we're just talking about people and we're not exploring that category. And so we're never really understanding how a disaster affects different groups. And when we talk about gender, we're never just talking about gender. We're talking about gender cross-cut with age, with ability, disability, with race, ethnicity, with education, with a whole bunch of other things. Because gender is a very diverse and heterogeneous category. So let's think about going beyond just talking about people and break that down a bit more to understand really how it's affecting people in all their diversity. The problem is we really don't have the data. I can stand here and I could talk for 3 hours on this, but on the basis of what? On the basis of, actually, when you think about the whole body of research that there is or there could be, there's only a very small proportion that addresses gender issues. And there's only a very small proportion where gendered data, gender disaggregated data, is collected. Actually, generally, it's not collected at all. Sex disaggregated data is collected, but very few places in the world go beyond male and female. Some do, and allow transgender or other categories for other people to identify with if they choose to. But we really, we know very little about men and women, boys and girls specifically, and we know far less about LGBTQIA identifying groups. When I talked at the beginning about struggle, it's perhaps elevating it a bit too much to talk about the struggle we went through, but it did feel like a struggle to get to the point for the Sendai Framework for Disaster Risk Reduction 2015 to 2030, to get that whole movement of UN entities, of member states around the world, NGOs and other interest groups to agree that in this framework we should campaign for disaggregated data. We began arguing for it decades ago, and it's only now in the Sendai framework that we still have it. What we don't have, we have the words in there, we don't yet have it really turned into action on the ground, and we don't yet have the outputs, but at least it's in the global framework. So potentially we have something to build on. So member states aren't prioritising. Most member states around the world will collect some disaster data, but a lot of them don't even collect that, never mind disaggregating by anything. So there's a problem. So it's quite a burden for member states to collect this kind of data. We have to recognise that. The disaster context is important. Typically, we see, if we do have data, that there are higher fatalities for women and girls than for men. But as I say, the context is really important because sometimes it's the reverse. It's not just about the fatalities. There are all sorts of other ways that people are affected by disasters, and women in particular, but other disadvantaged groups are also impacted, and gender-based violence is prominent. This was a relative latecomer to the research field, but there's growing evidence of the extent of gender-based violence. Lots of very interesting work coming out of Australia at the moment. There was some very good research done after the 2009 Black Saturday fires in Australia, and if you Google a few of those terms, you'll find the data. Deborah Parkinson and Claire Zara, and they did some very interesting qualitative interviews with women and men after that event. Other ways of impact on women particularly is their relative visibility, invisibility, and lack of opportunities in various ways. So as I said about the numbers of professors or women in leadership roles in the university, the same would be seen in many disaster management fields. You may have quite a few women who are running around doing the work, but often the senior positions are taken by men. That's slowly changing with many more, and in this country as well, many more women taking senior roles in disaster management, emergency planning. But it's been, I can tell you, a long time coming. So recovery post-disaster also negatively impacts women. Far less opportunities, far less compensation, a whole raft of things where women are far from being given more to bring them up to an equality, are actually receiving less. So it's like a downward spiral if we're not careful. One of the few bits of data we have, I call it data. Neumeier and Plumper 2007, where they did a statistical analysis. So it wasn't like us, gender campaigners. So you can say, you can dismiss what I say because I'm a gender campaigner, and I would say that, wouldn't I? So here's a couple of people who are taking a statistical analysis and just looking at what do the numbers say. And the numbers say more women die, and they die sooner than men, typically in disasters. When we have the data, it always tells a story. So you will see, if you look at this, a few names of events that pop up because there's so little data around, really, and even what we have is a bit iffy, let's say. So, has it really been verified? A lot of it hasn't. But there is data, and depending on the event and the circumstances and the context, typically you do get more women dying. But if you look at the two dot points at the bottom, there are examples where more men die than women. So you always have to look at the context and ask, well, why is this? I mean, this hazard, whatever it might be, a flood or a cyclone or an earthquake or whatever, it isn't steering its way around the population and knocking out this person and leaving this person. It's to do with how we live our lives in the everyday and the risk creation in the everyday that leads some people to be greatly disadvantaged to the point of dying in disasters. So yeah, the references are all in at the end of this, on a couple of slides at the end, so you can pick them up. Yeah.
Is there evidence to show that there's actually a development divide? Because the US and Europe are obviously more developed than, say, Bangladesh. And in the US, disasters, the male deaths are higher, and in the sort of Bangladesh and Sri Lanka, it's females. Is there any data or evidence that's been done sort of looking at that? Is it a development divide? I know you mentioned it earlier,
Yeah.
but is there any sort of physical evidence for development divide?
It would be a development divide then cross-cut by gender. So I don't think the development is the key variable here. Development is like a modifying variable here. And that the issue is around gender and how gender is lived and experienced wherever it is. So in the 2 points at the bottom, and I could add another one in there which would support my point, which would be 1998 and Hurricane Mitch in Latin America and Caribbean, where again more men died, and that's because of our gendered social norms, our expectations, and our expectations are that men and boys put themselves at risk. They go out and do the search and rescue. They go out but also they're as a badge of masculinity, doing gender, to do a Judith Butler on it, but to perform gender, men and boys have to be seen to be, tough and doing that kind of stuff. So if there is a flood and there's a barrier across the road saying, flood, do not cross, that's like a temptation, a big temptation. Wow, this is good, I'm going to drive through that. And they drive through and they drown. So there are different contexts, and that could be anywhere. But again, we can't really compare it because it's not a total scientific data set. So the way the data was collected, the reason it was collected, the methods used, and the hypotheses on which it was built, all of those will be different. So it's actually extremely difficult to compare one bit of data with another. If I've got time, I'll mention the centre we're starting, and one of our plans is to try and capture some of that. So yeah, yes.
Sorry.
Yeah, no, go ahead.
I was just going to ask.
Go back.
Yeah, about the same, and I guess this is very related to what you were just saying, but do any of these studies, the third one, right, says not just that more females than males die, but also at a younger age, right?
Yes.
Do any of the other studies also go into how this cuts across other demographic groups?
Very
like
few,
race or
yeah.
Class, that kind of thing?
Yeah, very few. Again, you're lucky if you get the gender data. If you get it also subdivided by other categories. I mean, if Sendai framework really delivered up, how many of you in the room have heard of the Sendai framework before I mentioned it? Is this something that you've come across? Okay. So Sendai framework is like the Millennium Development Goals or the Sustainable Development Goals, the SDGs. It's the SDGs of the disaster world. It's our global framework, with a set of priority areas and targets, and member states around the world sign up for it. And then every couple of years, they're meant to stand up in a big meeting and tell the world, what a great job they've done. Chances of it, the first one after the Sendai framework, which was this year in Cancun in Mexico, was very, very little reporting about having collected gender data. So it's not really a priority area yet. But the framework says gender, it says age, it says disability, other cultural aspects as well. So it's kind of watch this space a few years down the line, but like I said at the beginning, we won't just be given this data if we don't struggle for it. We've got to be demanding it. Otherwise, because one of the things that, I mustn't digress too much because I'll go over time, but one of the things that we haven't really talked about in our, or it hasn't been talked about publicly, let's say, in our campaign for getting disaggregated data, and I don't think the member states who've signed up to the Sendai framework have thought it through yet. What happens when they go out and collect the data and they get one of these horrible numbers back? You know, one of these, 4 times more females died in your recent disaster. That is a political death knell, you know. How do you deal with that? We haven't really, you know, that conversation isn't overtly out there. If it had been out there, we would never have got it into the framework, so I'm glad it's not out there, but it is going to be an issue, and it's going to be a problem for the member states to stand up and give that kind of response. So no wonder they're hesitating about collecting the data in the first place. Okay, men and boys affected, as we said. Then we're talking about socially constructed vulnerabilities each time. Risk-taking behaviour, masculine roles, poor health-seeking behaviour. So if you do have a hard time in a disaster, as a male, you're less likely to go and seek some professional help and professional support to deal with it. What tends to happen is this negative coping, particularly lots of alcohol, fed ironically by post-disaster compensation packages. So that there is, you know, there are examples of that. And for other gender groups, we don't have very much at all. So Oxfam did a really great job after the tsunami. They didn't actually go and collect data on the number of women that died. This was an observation when they went round villages after the 2004 tsunami and realised there weren't any women around. Where were the women? There was just so many men left and the women were not there. So they had to work it out by deduction almost. But they did a very good job of getting this out there. And I think this recognition that there is an issue started to take off a bit more after this. It was slow going before that. So there's some data out there. Why? I did a training exercise for the UN in Banda Aceh in Indonesia, and everyone in the room had lost someone in the tsunami, and I asked them, why was it that so many women died in Banda Aceh? And they said, well, the women were staying behind, they were collecting their children, or they're collecting elderly people that they were responsible for. And the men, they said, this is not some awful kind of imperialist position I'm taking, that the men just ran. And that's not to say the men, and there were lots of men in that room, are bad people. It was just automatic. They were socialized to do what they did. Fewer women can swim around the world, that's the case, or climb trees, do the kinds of things you needed to do. And if you see 2004 tsunami imagery and videos, because people, when I say the tsunami to you, you've probably got an image in your mind, I don't know, but you're probably seeing a big wave coming in, and that big wave is water. Well, for most people, by the time they experienced it, it was a wave of debris. It had trees in it. It had cars in it. It practically had houses in it. It was a moving wall of debris. And so to survive that, and you can see some imagery of that, people were riding along top of it, you know. That's quite difficult to do, depending on what you're wearing, depending on whether you're carrying a baby and some children or this kind of thing. But there are some excellent images in the Tsunami Museum in Banda Aceh by local and regional painters. And it shows men rescuing, paintings of men rescuing women and children. So it's not a completely simple picture. But again, it's socially constructed. It could have gone in different ways, but the women, many of the women were on shore because their job was not to go out in the fishing boats, but to be on shore to receive the fish catch, process the fish catch. The men were in the boats and they were out at sea, and if you know about tsunamis, you know, there's like a wave this big out at sea. It's not till it's built up that energy and come to shore that it's a dangerous wave. So you could ride it out to sea. Okay. So a lot of what we have been building around this comes out of the vulnerability paradigm, a vulnerability approach. And this is the word that you hear a lot. And it was very useful when it developed through the 70s and the 80s, borrowing from the development field, development studies, and looked at vulnerability, allied to marginalization, so a much tougher, more political approach. But it recognized that, you know, there are groups that are actively made vulnerable, actively excluded and marginalized. They lack access to power, to resources, and they're placed in positions where they face increased risk. However, over the years, that's become a bit of a kind of mantra, and it's become appropriated, I would say. And the way the term is used now, I mean, it's not a word, you know, as I said at the bottom, vulnerability, it's an ascribed term. It's not one that you assign to yourself, typically. You don't say, oh, I'm a vulnerable person. It's one that you say, oh, they're a very vulnerable group. And you don't particularly want to be called that, to be labelled that. It's disempowering, it's demeaning. So there are problems with the way vulnerability has been captured and then applied. So most often, if you look at gender and disaster data, or whenever anyone is writing or presenting on that, they're saying women are the most vulnerable group, as if they're poor, helpless, and passive beings, rather than being placed in a position which puts them at greater risk. We could talk about that some more. So prior to the first global platform after the Sendai framework was launched, so that was in Cancun, the Gender and Disaster Network is always given a booth at these global platforms. So we were given a booth again, and we thought, well, what should we put in there? So we decided to think about, because Gender and Disaster Network is 20 years old this year, so it was 1997, actually it was born, we thought, well, how have the kind of international frameworks, policy documents, the dominant terms, how have they changed since the 1990s, through the 2000s, and then into what we're in now, the 2010s, over that time. So a few of us just did a bit of work on that. It's not a big scientific project, it was just a bit of work searching the frameworks, some key journals, and also, for some of us, our own memories. So we put them on posters, which I'm going to show you, and then in the few days of the session, people could come up and they could add different terms. You could stick more post-it notes on it. So this was our take on it. And this is not all of the words, because you wouldn't be able to read it otherwise, but dominant terms in the 1990s when we were talking about our field. And natural came up a lot. Natural hazards, yes, but natural disasters still appearing, even though there's been probably 30 or 40 years of scholarship saying why you shouldn't call a disaster natural because it's socially constructed. Man-made, that's one of my real bête noirs, that is. It's genderblind. You know, this is the kind of language that was around in, say, the Yokohama strategy in the 1990s, and the IDNDR, which was the International Decade for Natural Disaster Reduction, in the 1990s. In the 2000s, started to change a bit. In the middle of the 2000s, we had the Hyogo Framework for Action, the HFA. We also continually had Gender and Disaster Network as a platform for discussing some of these things and for trying to influence the policy process. We heard about a needs-based approach, so it's very much about vulnerable women needing something, and about more women's participation. Gender came into it, but really we're talking about women usually. And then we move into the period we're in now, the decade we're in now, and the Sendai framework, and it has changed over that time. The language has changed. GBV, gender-based violence, was not a thing that people talked about in the 1990s. Started to emerge in the 2000s, but for certain interest groups. Now it's much more out there, and the UN has really taken it up. And it's much more about gender. It's about men as well, and men and masculinities, and not just women and women's needs and women's vulnerabilities. And also it's about women's leadership. So it's not just have a quota system and make sure you've got at least 30% women in whatever committee it is that you're setting up. It's about developing, building capacity for, and creating the enabling environment for women to lead committees to whatever the initiative might be. So things have changed. But I would say, you know, those terms have taken a lot of work to get to that point. The way the UN system is organised, it's organised for civil society to input around major groups. There are several major groups, and there's a women's major group, as the UN calls it. We call it something different, but they call it the women's major group. And we organise for all these things, and we make sure that somebody, usually more than one, is at all the negotiation meetings and will speak up on this. And throughout the process, and this is a process over years, getting up to this point, we still had, you know, the day before we were having a negotiation meeting, and the chair of that meeting was still trying to take out all of that, the words that we were trying to put in on disaggregation by gender and age and disability. We had a great big long list originally, and it got shorter and shorter. Same with the SDGs, they had a great big long list. We tried to argue, well, the SDGs have got this great big long list, we want the same great big long list. They weren't having that. But right up to the last minute, the chair, a new chair, comes in and thinks, this is a bit messy, why don't we just call them people? Because we campaigned for 2 years to get you to recognise, if you don't name them and put them out there, it's easy to invisibilise them. So you need to recognise these different groups. But it's a struggle. So we'll just say something to end. Sorry, I'm a little bit late. I'll get through this quickly. On flood hazards, because Louise asked for that. But it's not very floody, Louise. It's just a little bit floody. So just refer to a couple of projects, European projects, the Microdis project and the Embrace project, and just to kind of bring it together and think about the gender issue. Not that they were at all gendered projects primarily. So those are the two projects. The websites are there. The Embrace project has got the various outputs and reports, and you can get all that stuff from the website. So Microdis 2007 to 2011 was interesting because it was Europe and Asia. We tried to have comparable studies across the continents. 16 partners. It was very much around preparedness and mitigation and prevention strategies, but had a social health and economic impacts focus. The Embrace project from 2011 to 2015, bit smaller, 11 partners, and this was around building resilience to disasters amongst communities in Europe. So all the buzzwords were in there, no wonder they gave us the money. We're still trying to finish the book. It's almost ready, but a lot of the material's on the website. So just as an example, just trying to pull out a gender, even though, as I said, it wasn't primarily a gendered project, from the Microdis project. And we have just, my colleague and I published a paper to publish this. But if you look at mental health impacts, there are standardized scales in psychology for measuring impacts. And the psychologists on our team wanted to use those scales. So we used those scales, and one bit of it was around emotional well-being. So after very serious floods in Morpeth, in north of England, we wanted to see if there were any differences in people's emotional well-being after those events. And we were a bit surprised to find that there wasn't a huge difference in the scores that came out for the men and the women. But we didn't want to leave it at that, so we explored a bit further about what was behind those different scores. And what we found was that although the scores were very similar, the predictors for how people got to that level of emotional well-being were very different according to whether they were men or women. And what was behind the women's emotional well-being, or its reverse if that was the case, but their level of emotional well-being had to do with their connectedness, their embeddedness in the communities in which they lived. And for the men, the variable really that was important was the extent to which they felt in control of the situation. So these are almost, typical gendered stereotypes. But we didn't make it up, it came out of the data. And it told us something also about, well, we need to know these things because we need to know after a disaster how people are moving through that disaster and how they're recovering and what it is that helps them get to a good position. And a couple of you might have seen some of this slide that's going to come up in a minute, but we heard, well, it's embeddedness in community is important, but what do we mean by community? That's a whole other, you could have a whole other seminar on community, as we know. And people rarely analyse it, it's just assumed. It's just a word and no one unpacks it. And it usually means something nice, and it usually means a geographical boundary, actually. The community is Morpeth or Durham or whatever it might be. But actually gender and place are quite different. So in one of our community engagement events, we asked people about the extent, what they thought about their community and what was their community. And so we gave people maps and we asked them to draw a boundary. So for example, and this is kind of an anonymised one, and we luckily had a few married couples. So they were living at the same address and they did this separately. And the men drew this boundary. They said, oh, that's my road, yeah, that's my community. And that was the woman's community. So they're living at the same place, but the meaning of community to them is completely different. Because for the men, they're focused on, this is my house, I get in my car and I go off to my job, which is somewhere else. And the women are thinking, well, this is my house, and then I walk across to the shops there, and I take the dog for a walk, I take the kids to school, I visit this person here. It's a much expanded engagement with the community, and that was important to them in their recovery process. So yeah, there is a paper on that. Yeah.
So is that a reference for this reason?
Yeah.
Yeah, I just wanted
They're at the back. The last couple of slides, there's a list, full, a proper bibliography. So then just quickly on the Embrace project, which we did, and we did in this country, our case studies were in the Lake District, and we looked particularly at Keswick, Cockermouth and Workington. It was kind of a from the mountains to the sea approach. And we developed a framework. I don't have time to go into that, but basically we're trying to understand what is it about community resilience, and that's really another lecture, and I won't have time to go through it all. But we thought what was important were civil protection is always there to an extent, but the social protection as well. So over here. So civil protection and social protection underpinning people's day-to-day lives. Their resources and capacities, and also the extent to which they were learning. Everyone was learning from past experiences. It's a whole bunch of things that leads to community resilience. And we did some social network mapping. And we plugged it all into various bits of software, and we wanted to find out about how people were linking with each other, what resources they were using, and you don't really need to know the detail as I rush through this, but just look at the pretty picture, and it does come out looking nice, but we analysed it according to the three key sectors we were interested in: civil protection, the community, and the wider social protection. But then we thought about the gender issue, and where is the gender in it? Because the social networks that people operate in, as we've seen in the previous project, for women, their embeddedness in the community was important, so their networks were important. But for the men, their sense of control was important. So who you know and what resources you can get is important. So who were these key people that kept emerging? Because that's what came out of the data. And a lot of them were women, actually. But we found, and you don't need to see the detail on these, it's just the points that I'd like to get over. This is what the analysis showed for a key female and a key male in Keswick, and the kind of links, etc. And it was very diverse, and actually what you needed was the two together. So you needed the way the women, the key women, were networking, and you needed the way the men were key networking. And being Keswick, up here, we've lost it. royal ambassador is in there. You know, it's like, who knows Prince Charles? Let's get Prince Charles here. So, you know, if you can call on that kind of networking power, you can bring visibility, resources and prioritisation to your locality. Poor old Workington couldn't do any of that. I mean, it really, really struggled. But these kinds of networks allowed Keswick to lobby very successfully, actually, although they would argue not as successfully as they'd like, but they did manage to get a flood scheme. And women leaders were important. So this is Lynn Jones at the top at Keswick. This is her giving a presentation to parliamentary committee. Sue Cashmore in Cockermouth, just down the road from Keswick, got a British Empire Medal for her work. So women leaders are everywhere, but they're not given the visibility that they should be given. So concluding then, for those of you who are interested in this topic, you know, there are a lot of resources out there. And I was at a meeting last year, this is a regional Asia Pacific meeting, which went a bit further in terms of the language used in the recommendations that came out. So there's a link there, you can get the report. I'm not sure, can you read that at the back, or is it a bit small? But you don't need to read it now, but invest was in there. So it's not just a recognise blah blah blah, it's invest in it. Money, people, time, other resources into whatever initiative it might be. Leadership came up, rights came up, legal and institutional frameworks. People didn't want just a recommendation in a report. They wanted this to go right the way through a legal process. So it couldn't just be dismissed and rubber stamped. It became a legal process. So worth having a look at that. So we've looked at gender, but we haven't had time to look at these other intersecting axes of difference. And they can make it look very different. So a white woman, middle class, well, be upper middle class in the US, would come out with a very different outcome, say in post Katrina, than a working class black woman. They're both women, but they actually occupy different worlds, and that's in the United States. So, you know, that's the same around the world. We still lack the action on the ground, and it's still important to just ask that gender question. So whatever you're looking at, you can just say, well, I wonder how this would affect men and women differently, or I wonder who got what in these outcomes, or how are people travelling through? If you get so many people dead, so many people recovering from X disaster, who are they? Is it really everybody across the board, or is it certain social groups who are recovering well and others not? So it just seems like the more we change these things, the more it remains the same, that we still have to ask these gendered questions. And we launched the Gender and Disaster Network in 1997 because no one was doing anything, and we just needed to talk to each other, and we were all in different countries. And ideally, Gender and Disaster Network should have disappeared by now, but it hasn't, because the need is still there. It should have, you know, we should have achieved all this, and it shouldn't be necessary, but it is. And so there is a problem. If you look through the paperwork, you look through the frameworks, you'll see gender and women sometimes all through it, but where is the difference happening on the ground? There is some, but it's not systematic, and there's still a huge amount that needs to be done. So hence we are launching a Centre for Gender and Disaster at UCL in March, on International Women's Day, March the 8th. And it will be, what we're trying to do is build that evidence base, a really strong scientific evidence base. And that will complement what we do in the Gender and Disaster Network, which is advocacy and policy development work. Okay, so there's some of the, just the ones that I've mentioned are in there if you want to look at those. That's it, thank you.
Thank you very much.
And everything, like how are they doing, how's the normal life changes in everyday life, and I'm especially focusing on the women, household head women, but there are also
what do we need to do?
women.
I haven't quite.
Maybe you should
Sorry, let me
keep
just
on
stop
doing
this. So you have to press stop on this.
like a mini brief summary.